Hello, everyone. Welcome to Free Speech as a Right and When It Causes Pain. My name is Michelle Willette. I am coordinating the ethics colloquies this semester. And we're very happy to have our panel here today. We have Pat Rascoe, our University Police Chief, Dr. John McMahon, Associate Professor of Political Science, Ray Carman, Associate Professor of Political Science, and our Faculty Senate Chair. We have Liz Onasch, Assistant Professor of Sociology, and Portia Turco, who is Clinical Health Counseling Program Coordinator and Award Health Counseling Clinic Director, to join me in welcoming them. And I have a few questions to launch things off. So first, I wanted to ask, well, free speech is viewed as a foundational right, important to our freedom. People often debate about whether or not there should be limits to free speech, in part because it can mislead people, and in part because it can cause pain. The Supreme Court, though, has just ruled in the case of a cheerleader who wrote very insulting and nasty things on social media to express feelings about her team and her school. It just ruled on behalf of free speech. So free speech is here to stay. And I wonder if you could discuss this and talk just briefly about the significance of that ruling. And there are a couple of microphones here, so if you want to.
Should Ray start? Is
Would you like?
He's the closest.
Law scholar.
Good afternoon, everyone. So the first thing I'll say is kind of what the current Supreme Court precedent is, not specifically in that case, but just generally in terms of free speech. So when we think about speech, there are different categories of speech, and some can be regulated more than others. So for example, commercial speech can be regulated much more than political speech can. But if we're talking about speech that in some way touches on politics, the Supreme Court has said in modern times that has the most protection because it's central to being a democracy, to have debates. This was not always the case. It used to be, for example, that laws could say you couldn't criticize the government. Could you imagine having lived in the last decade or more and not been able to criticize the government? People who advocated for socialism or communism, for civil rights, those were the people who were prosecuted as violating basically strict laws that forbid certain types of speech. And the Supreme Court was fine with that, had no problems with that. Really until we get into the 1960s. In the late 1960s, the Supreme Court rules in this case called Brandenburg versus Ohio that speech, like we're talking about here, there are two prongs that the speech would need to meet in order for the government to be able to ban it. The first is that it is directing at inciting imminent lawless action. So the speaker is trying to basically get the audience to break the law, to become violent, to destroy property, things like that. And then the second is that it is likely to produce that speech. So there's a likelihood requirement. As long as speech falls short of that, it's okay. Now, there are also exceptions for true threats. So if someone were to, name someone and talk about how they are going to hurt them, threaten them, then that could be something that is not protected. That's an exception. There are a few others. There's also reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. The college, for example, could say, you can't go out at 3 in the morning and start shouting with a bullhorn your political message of the day, right? And it's not because of what your message is. That wouldn't be allowed. It's because, we have people sleeping and we're in a community and we don't want that type of noise going on at the time. And so those are okay. But generally speaking, we are now in the situation where we protect speech. And the Supreme Court has said this is hugely important, even though it causes pain. And we can talk more about that later. Specifically about the cheerleading case, that was an interesting situation because that speech happened off campus. I believe it didn't actually name anyone, though it was clear kind of who they were talking about and what they were upset about. But it was on social media and it was off campus. And so the court is grappling with, well, what do we do? If she said that in a classroom, she could clearly be punished for that. She would be disrupting the learning environment. The Supreme Court has said that is hugely important and that schools can limit, particularly below the college level, what is said depending on the age of the audience. But what about on her own time, using her private account? Well, the Supreme Court said, basically it's okay. She's venting, she's angry, she didn't threaten anyone, there wasn't a true threat, she wasn't inciting imminent lawless action, and if we allow that speech to be regulated, then anything someone posts as a student on social media could be regulated. And so the Supreme Court wasn't willing to go there.
Well, so just generally as a consumer of the First Amendment, and more so that than anything else, police departments, we follow rules that are established by others. But in cases of First Amendment and freedom of expression and those sorts of things, right to protest, we have the government role of also providing that both sides of the issue have an equal opportunity to voice their opinion and safeguard their ability to do that unless certain things happen where the assembly becomes so disruptive or dangerous that we just need to stop everybody from speaking and break it up. We have sort of this challenge we're pulling against ourselves of trying to provide a space for both sides of the argument to come out, but also protecting the victims of some speech that is not protected. And some of those were shared today, and it feels to me that it's evolving, and not that the case law is showing it. If you look at most of the cases, they were decided in the 60s and 70s, and things have been heard recently. The one with the cheerleader was clearly one that I don't know how it got to the Supreme Court, because that was a very easy First Amendment case from the get-go. But as these cases, as there is enforcement action or as there are lawsuits brought to challenge speech, these more and more cases are going to be coming before the Supreme Court, and I would not be surprised if there were slight tweaks to some challenges. Social media being one of them. You know, there are pieces to the puzzle. There are details in every case that now involve social media, and social media wasn't around, back in the 1700s, and so the ability, you can have the same argument about assault weapons. When these amendments were, the Constitution was written, there was no thought that we'd have such an ability of one person or a lot of people to challenge the thought of one person and how to struggle with that. So there is precedence created a long time ago in the 60s and 70s, as I said, that we currently follow today. However, I think from my perspective, being a law enforcement officer and dealing with situations when they arise, there will be an instance where probably law enforcement will take action to stop something from happening because it's resulting in something that will cross the line of something that has been protected from the 60s or 70s, that is going to rise to the level of the Supreme Court. And maybe that is where this begins pushing and opens up this sort of consequential argument of what is protected and what is not. Clearly political speech, certainly that's the reason we have freedom of speech, to be able to challenge those political ideas and our governance. But some things are not protected. Pornography, some kinds of pornography, statements that an imminent violent action will result because of somebody requesting somebody to do something. One of the recent decisions, I don't know if it's a freedom of speech decision, but there was certainly arrest where a student urged another student to commit suicide, and that suicide actually did happen. And I don't know if that's still making its way through the Supreme Court, but I know there was a finding of guilty in that trial, and so certainly there's going to be a First Amendment challenge to that. So it's an evolving time right now, and I think sort of being legitimate and working from a place of good faith for in terms of what law enforcement is going to do, at least in my department, is how we're going to operate on a case-by-case basis, because they're all different. Sorry, it's long-winded on that.
So along those lines, with social media, last year, a case came to light where there was a posting by a staff member it seems like she posted, where I know there are some details because no one actually saw the original post, but it seems like she posted on a Facebook post that was talking about lynching, and that she posted in a way that was not in disagreement with the post. It was feeding into it. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about some of the limits of, I know people were very confused because the college had limits in what it was able to do in response. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that situation, which again is part of the unfolding mess that is social media.
I can share just briefly. So in that particular case, not to speak to the details of it, because in that particular case, the details are very scarce. I don't think anybody's actually has a copy of the post and the thread. So that being aside, I'll speak to that type of case generally. Context becomes important. So a post taken out of a thread, if it's the first post in response to a thread that is something that is very violent and some speech that is not protected. Certainly the next post, if it adds to it or pushes in that direction, I would say that speech likely is lumped in with the very first statement that is not protected. It all depends on what exactly is said. But as you get down into 30 and 40, responses to responses, what are you responding to? Are you responding to the original post or are you responding to something somebody else said? So context becomes important, and the details are super important to make sure there's a true knowledge of the 5 W's.
Well, I think who is it that is trying to take action? So the First Amendment applies to the government. Whether it is the federal government, Congress shall make no law, is how it begins. It was expanded to state and local governments, and it includes places like here. We're a state institution. Therefore, the First Amendment applies to us. Now, if this employee had been at a private college, if they didn't have any other types of labor protections or something like that, it would be a much different case. They could terminate the employee. In a situation like this, and again, not knowing all of the facts, because it wasn't a threat, a direct threat, a true threat, because it's not clear exactly necessarily what this person was liking. I think it was a like, which some courts have said likes are speech. They do convey something, so there's that complication there that the Supreme Court hasn't. Generally speaking, as a state institution, we have those same First Amendment prohibitions and protections that apply to the federal government, to Congress, to anywhere else. And so we're restricted in that capacity. Now, that doesn't mean that the institution can't respond, and this is always my kind of go-to. The institution has a First Amendment right, and the leaders have a First Amendment right. And so what do you do? Well, we say that we don't tolerate, we don't accept, we don't approve of that type of language. We show what we value instead. That kind of is a Supreme Court sanctioned response, which is the answer to speech you don't like is speech that you do like, speech that you do approve of. And so that was what I was urging at the time, and that's what the administration, did, was say this is what we value, and what you're doing is not what we value.
I think it's also important, I'll come at it from a mental health standpoint. I think that when we look at, I'm picking apart the word pain, and I'm actually deepening the focus on the idea that some of what we consider pain is actually systematic complex trauma, right? So when you look at the idea that this is a post, this is talking about lynching, it's looking at it from an isolated standpoint. But we know that people who are targets of these types of messages are faced with multiple instances over long periods of time. So when we look at trauma, we have a diagnostic. So our current psychiatric diagnostic manual is recognizing post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder results from a single incident of a traumatic event that the individual felt that their life was at risk, or somebody that they care about, their life was at risk, or that they imagined that this might be true. This type of categorization is problematic because it doesn't account for historical trauma. It doesn't account for generational trauma. And what we know in our research is that trauma, when it's not healed, when it's not treated, it actually genetically transfers. So this is studies from epigenetics that tell us that as a Black individual, I don't have to have seen somebody being lynched, but my genetic code has become sensitive to that. So I think that the challenge when you talk about values, our social contract as an institution, it has to account for the idea that just seeing something like that is causing injury, right? So we know from studies that talk to us about race-based traumatic stress, and this is a lot of social justice advocacy on a lot of us clinicians of color. We're arguing that we need to have this in our diagnostic manual. So that because there's an injury that's happening. It's not a physical injury necessarily. The verbal injury is impacting historical injury, and it's impacting microaggressions, which we know are routine, everyday slights, right? That happen to a lot of people of color. So, and for us, we saw this, I think, as a campus. I would argue that in the last 5 years, we've seen traumatized students, we've seen traumatized faculty of color, staff of color, and we're seeing this as a repeated event. And so some of those symptoms actually affect learning. And so if we're talking about ourselves as an institution of learning, and we're talking about things that happen that affect learning, so what is our social responsibility to that, right? So I think that for me, I'm looking at the pain, and I want to say, can we add the word trauma next to the pain? That this is systemic injustice.
Just to kind of go along with that, and this is from a more sociological kind of standpoint, I'd also like to think about pain in relation to harm or injury, as you said. And you mentioned there's this kind of balance, we're thinking about our values, and so there's a really balance between protecting free expression, but also promoting a safe, supportive learning environment and community for all of the members and groups within our community. And so there's this balance between liberty, freedom of expression, and equality, so freedom to accessing education. And we know that access to education is harmed in some ways by these kinds of, this kind of speech. So I just wanted to also, thinking about the concept of harm as opposed to pain, I think draws our attention to, as you were also alluding to, the kind of broader systems, right? So to what extent does a speech act cause harm? In what cases can words actually cause harm? And I think in order to answer that question, you have to think about, is that speech act, and again, I'm saying speech act, right? So speech is not just words, it can actually be doing something. Other than inciting people to violence, right? Speech can be creating new norms or allowing for permissiveness of ways of treating people or understanding people. And so if that speech act is creating a norm or perpetuating a norm that allows for the oppression of people who have been historically oppressed and are continuously oppressed, then that's harm, right? And so I'm not an expert on the Constitution at all, but I'd be interested to think about how we balance like the 14th Amendment with the freedom of speech. Sorry.
To build a little bit on, on what my previous two colleagues have said, that I think that one of the things to consider when we bring this more systemic perspective is the way in which rights themselves are often quite formal, are often quite abstract, right? And how they then become actualized in practice, right? Part of that is a route that goes through the laws and our particular system, right? The way the laws are interpreted by court systems. But then another kind of thing that shapes the way that these formal abstract rights come into practice, right, is through kind of shared or contentious, and oftentimes both, political and ethical values, right? So to say that we can affirm a right to free speech means something. Saying that we can affirm a right to free speech and do so from an intentionality with a political value of anti-oppression or of equity or something like that has quite a different impact, right, when we think about how free speech functions. And so I think that when we talk about rights generally, and free speech is perhaps an excellent example for this, the thinking about the way and the factors that go into shaping the reality of formal abstract rights is really important. I think that both of what my previous two colleagues have said speaks to that, because in a society, in a country that is shaped by hundreds of years of racial and other forms of oppression, right, the values that undergird the enactment of free speech are also going to be shaped by that very same history, right? So I think that there's this constant interplay between political culture, political values, and laws as they're written on the books and laws that are, as they are interpreted by courts. And I think that interplay is kind of absolutely crucial to the kind of questions and the ideas that my colleagues have been sharing.
So I agree with what my colleagues have said. One of the things that always I think about when I think about the First Amendment is, who is it that historically has been oppressed? It's not, the white mainstream political people, right? Because as long as you have a political majority who agrees with what you're saying, you don't need First Amendment protection because you have political protection there. It's the people who are fighting for rights, the people who are fighting for change that need that. It's the minorities, and I don't mean that necessarily racial, though it includes racial, but the political minority, the group that doesn't have that majority support, because the political system will protect the people expressing the majority. And so that's something that I always think about. And Liz asked the question about the balance between the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and the First Amendment. And I wish, taking off the hat of what is and going to the what I wish they were treated equally important by the Supreme Court. I wish they were. I wish that we read the Equal Protection Clause as providing the same type of protection that we do the First Amendment. The First Amendment is seen as, this amendment above the other amendments. And I think that's important, but I don't think that means the Equal Protection Clause shouldn't be up there as well. And so that's somewhere where I hope things will change over time. I don't know that this Supreme Court will be doing it, but maybe one day. And I think that's something that we should push towards. It's not an either or in any stretch, though right now it's a First Amendment more important than not. And as the demographics of the country change, as the ideology of the country change, then suddenly the people who might need First Amendment protection changes. And we're starting to see some of that now. If you look at people who are kind of saying, oh, well, the First Amendment protects me in my speech, yes, they're right, but there are also people who are espousing kind of these hateful views. And it's because society is starting to change. And so therefore, they're the ones that are turning to the protection. But historically, that has not been the case at all.
So you've already begun to really get into kind of the ethics centered around free speech and the fact that it can cause harm, it can cause pain, it can activate and cause trauma. So I wonder if you could explore that a little further. I mean, I think there are two levels that it could be looked at. One is systematic, as an institution, as a government, as a society, what are the obligations surrounding that? But the other is also individual. What as people who may inflict trauma on others, what are our obligations? Should we never say anything that might hurt someone? Is that possible? What are our obligations when we ourselves are triggered by something someone says? What are our obligations when we see someone else who is harmed by it? I wonder if you could just explore some of those layers. There are a lot of layers there.
If I may, Michelle, I think this is a question that I'd actually be curious about from really our participants today. So I wonder if we could just spend a few minutes just hearing from everybody's their thoughts on that before we go into it a little bit further.
So I come from the stance as a digital media professional, so I'm helping to train the next level of digital media content creators, especially in the social media space, which we know is riddled with online hate and speech that causes harm to a lot of people. And we know that regulating in the US is probably impossible for that speech. So, I always am thinking about, what is the user responsibility, right? We all now have this power to publish worldwide, right? It's no longer I'm just saying it to my friend or my family member. I am, speaking to a much larger audience. And we've been given this power with very little guidance, right? And regulation or training of any kind, right? We put small children on our smartphones without giving them the proper media literacy education that is needed to create the responsibility in users. Because I do believe, like you said, what is the obligation? We all have that, right? We have the obligation to take pause before we react, to take pause before we post, and think about, how does this speech, one, really reflect my true values and my true understanding of my place in society, but two, how is it going to be received by the audience in which I'm writing to?
Violated. It's just my thought. I don't necessarily have a question wrapped around that or anything, but maybe you can comment on that.
I spent a lot of that day screaming Raymond at my TV. Because, clearly there the speakers incited imminent lawless action. They intended to do so, and it was pretty likely that they were going to. So, for me, that speech is definitely not protected by the First Amendment, and caused, grave damage, threatened the lives of not only the Vice President, but also many members of Congress. Cost the lives of several police officers and a protester. That, talk about trauma, talk about speech that's not protected, and what happens because of it. Legally, it'll be interesting to see. We're starting to see some of those cases be prosecuted. A lot of people are pleading guilty. Hard not to when you're caught on, a bunch of different cameras doing those things, and you have no right to be there at the time. But what happens? Does anyone raise First Amendment cases? Is a case brought against the former president? That would be interesting to see. I think, personally speaking, he's certainly liable for what happened, and the First Amendment wouldn't be a defense to that. So, does something happen about it? But yeah, that's really the elephant in every room nowadays when we talk about speech.
And I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about systematic power, right? So that was a very real example to a lot of us about who holds the power and who gets a right to say whatever they want to say and do what they want to do and still be protected. Yeah. Because it really happened at a time when we were seeing protests, right? We've seen protests and we see how different protesters get treated. So this is very much about who holds the power and whose rights are more privileged than others.
And the entitlement.
And the entitlement.
Right? Like, this couldn't have gone that way. And so therefore, the election was stolen and we have to storm the Capitol and potentially kill the Vice President. Like, the entitlement there in it.
So let's change faces and put different faces to the people who stormed into it. So what would happen there? Yeah. So who's more protected, right? So some of the structural nature and the historical nature, all of these are intersectional, right? You cannot look at one and not look at the other parts. And so if you think about, if you're looking once again at social media and you're looking at some of the feedback from minoritized communities about the impact of observing how that happened and what happened afterwards, and you're going to see the injury again, right? That whose voice is elevated and whose voice is not. Right? So a lot of that, once again, is systematic, right? So to answer your question.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I'd just add, again, drawing on this systemic perspective, it's a way to address one of the questions that you had asked about, should we never say anything that could hurt anyone, right? I think it's important to look at the content and the impact of what you're going to say, and hurting someone because you forgot their birthday or something, right? That's different than contributing to an already oppressive structure or system that's in place, right? So that would be one way to kind of think about whether what you're going to say is potentially going to cause harm, and that is, does it kind of reify or reinforce structures of inequality that already exist, right? So it's not, you have to look at the structures and what's already happened in order to decide if something, what kind of harm that it could cause, whether it's actually oppressive harm or whether it's kind of personal or random.
And I think that kind of thinking about the power relations that exist, or thinking systematically and intersectionally, is precisely what's missing about so much of discourse about free speech right now. Because the people who, I'm saying how kind or not to be, the people who have a lot to say about so-called cancel culture or the lack of free speech are people who traditionally, right, have been the people whose free speech rights have not had to be protected, right? And so really what the complaint is about is not like a lack of free speech, but it's a lack of consequence and pushback free speech, right, for people in power, a lot of people whose like embodiment looks like mine, right, as a cis white male, right? And so it's like the lack of attention to the questions of power relations, of how does free speech work to reproduce or strengthen oppressive systems or dominating systems versus free speech that would contest those systems. And I do think that's like a really useful criteria for considering how our speech is going to act, right? And that like sounds like very kind of grand and big, but that's true like whether we're in a political demonstration or that's true whether we're posting on social media. I think that those values are going to manifest differently in those different contexts, right? But they're still going to be the same basic underlying values, right? And this is particularly interesting when we think about the way that free speech rights intersect with other First Amendment rights. So I'm thinking particularly about the freedom of assembly with regards to January 6th and the responses by my colleagues. When we think about, we know what the protesters, if they look differently, right, how they're treated. Right? We only need to look to see the differing interpretations of First Amendment rights of Black Lives Matter protesters and New York Police Department ramming cars through protesters or kettling protesters, right? So those are different interpretations of what constitutes politically protected speech and what constitutes free assembly, right? And so there's a way in which this is all wrapped into the other kinds of rights that are always tied to free speech rights.
And we don't even need to go as far as New York City. In DC itself, the president had the walk to the church there cleared of protesters by the military using tear gas and helicopters, right? So even the same place, same city, same, couple block radius, we see a completely different outcome. And so, that day, that was another thought, of course, going through my mind, and some commentators mentioned it. But if this were Black Lives Matter protesters or any protesters that look different than the people who were protesting, at least the overwhelming majority of them, that response would have been very different. And that says a lot about, our culture and our system and what it is that we value and how we express those values. And the other thing I want to say quickly is something John mentioned in terms of consequences. And the First Amendment does not say your speech is protected from any consequences. It just says that Congress can't jail you or a public institution can't fire you because of your speech if it's protected. That doesn't mean that I can't judge you for what you say. It doesn't mean that I can't decide I'm not going to support this business because of what their employees say or do. And so we have that power, and that's an important thing. Cancel culture is one thing, and I mean, I think as kind of a society, we should think about, well, what might be the best way to approach this? Is it like completely shutting someone down? Is that the best case scenario? And in some cases, yes. But in others, maybe it's conversations and it's trying to bring the person along and get them to understand what's wrong. But your speech is protected, but it's not consequence-free. We're all judged by what we say.
And I think that's a great point, actually, because, you know, when we look at cancel culture and we look at it from a trauma lens, from a trauma standpoint, you know that when people are pushed into a corner and they have no other options, what do? Right? So the paradox of social media is that for a lot of minoritized people, it's become a vehicle for social change in a way, right? So, and this goes back to people's reactions too, people who are traumatized, their reactions. So when you look at the reaction outside of the scope of understanding of what trauma will do, the behavior looks irrational, right? Like, why are people doing this? Why are you breaking down buildings? Why are you burning down things? But if you look at that in isolation without looking at the history of being silenced, of having no option, of having no voice, of having no support, the behavior doesn't look quite so irrational. So cancel culture might be an extreme reaction to extreme behavior, right? So when people feel like they haven't had an option, any other option, some of the behaviors that you see look irrational, but this is really the behavior of somebody who doesn't have any other thing to do, right? So I think that all of this from a trauma lens, that's why I come back to the systematic nature of it, right? That we have to understand and I'm thinking about, I mean, a good example of that are Black women. Like, so we have this social location where when we caught reacting strongly to oppression, we have that label of being angry Black women, right? But the research is consistent that the early behavior is actually being silenced. So people are silenced long enough to a point where there's an eruption. But in erupting from the pressure, that boiler point, that's when you get caught, and then you end up with this label that you are irrational, you are angry, you are aggressive, right? But take it back to slavery. We can go back all the way back there. So when you go back to slavery, think about who God protected them, right? Women and children, but Black women are not women, right? They're not women. So you can take your children, you can enslave them, you can sell them. She can't cry because crying gets more punishment. So fast forward to complex trauma today. So what happens? You silence yourself long enough to a point of eruption, and when you erupt, you are angry and aggressive, right? So a lot of these cannot be looked at in isolation. You've got to take all of the historical pieces, you have to conceptualize them that way, and then explain the behavior that you see in minoritized people when you have something that looks simple, like an Instagram post of lynching. And think about at what point in our history have we addressed that? Have we amended that? Have we healed that? We haven't. There's no historical basis. So it hasn't healed. So it's a wound that keeps getting inflamed. And so it looks like an overreaction, but it really isn't, right? So, and I see a couple of hands. I want to make sure I give people a chance. Any other thoughts?
Just a couple of things I want to add. Okay, so you think about in the field of education, and we work with the teacher candidates, and all of them, and none of us is actually isolated from each other, right? We watch what is going on, and they absorb that. But what we hear very often when engaging in a conversation, similar conversation like this, our teacher candidates share constantly a fear of offending others. If we bring this so-called freedom of speech in the classroom so everyone can share what they have got in their mind, because that's what we want to do, right? We want to build a community that we trust each other and will feel safe to share what we want to say. And that fear, when we dig deeper, it will become, so what do you mean by that? They will say, well, if I use, for example, if I use multicultural children's literature in teaching, the non-dominant culture, then will my students of, parents of my student of color feel offended? This is one of the fear. The other fear is, will my other students, meaning students coming from the dominant group, will feel being forced to learn this? Okay, so those are the fear that we have to address, talking about social or systematic and also social obligation for teachers or for teacher educators who are working with them. So this is one of the things I want to share. Another thing is, if we look in the classroom, going to back to what Ray said, right? Historically, whose voices are heard, whose voices are being oppressed. Predominantly in the classroom, we got more than 80% of our teachers in K-12 classrooms are still white, right? I don't need to mention about the real demographic of the public schools and also private school classrooms. So there's a power relationship. Words coming from the teachers definitely had more impact on the students, right? So if the teacher said something, if we have a teacher coming from the dominant group said something, and they're very, I think, with the influence of media, we automatically think, their speeches are protected because that's a freedom of speech, even though we do have some ethics of code in the profession. But then, are there the people whose voices need to be, or who are protected? Or if it is different, if a student of color in the classroom says something, is that actually the one dismissed? What I've heard is actually, if the teacher decides to use, say, a controversial piece of adolescent children's literature, what I actually have heard is parents will protest that and saying, no, my children's not going to read that. We have First Amendment, freedom of speech. We choose not to read that literature because it doesn't go with whatever, okay? And then I heard actually, this is not really very far long ago, the school district had to hold a board meeting to vote whether this piece of literature can be adopted as a universal reading for ninth grade ELA course. The school district decided, oh, okay, we can, we have to protect their right. So they ended up saying, making this optional. So again, that's another good example, right? Whose right got protected and whose rights got dismissed.
And I think that's a great point, actually, because what you are talking to is whose history gets elevated, right? Because when we're looking at pedagogy, when we're looking at whose culture gets promoted and sustained in pedagogy, when we're not taking that culturally responsive lens of being inclusive and making sure that all of the histories are represented, we're going to find that we're marginalizing. So then, in a way, this right becomes a way to oppress, right? Yeah. Because we all are seeing this. This has become a little bit more mainstream of how are we teaching our students, right? This becomes a big question. Yeah. A couple more points from everybody. Ian, go ahead.
I'm so glad that Jan mentioned the children's literature issue, because every year the American Library Association releases a list of books that have been banned and challenged in schools and in public libraries and private libraries. And every year that list is very heavy in books that depict the lived experiences of children and families that are LGBTQIA+, or Hispanic, Latino, African American, and the numbers of challenges aren't going down. And I believe it's reflective of the fact that the people in our society who traditionally had power are reluctant to see that, to share that power with other groups. To that end, the last week in September is Banned Books Week, and the library every year here on campus does a banned books readout. Keep an eye out for the publicity, which will be starting next week, because our library will be participating in that, because I think it's important to make sure that everybody is aware of other families and children's experiences.
My question or comment is on Google Green and Carman. But how about death? The science is abundantly clear that the misinformation on the social media systems that say something to the contrary. So here we have free speech that is causing death. Can we talk about that for a moment?
So I want to actually just take a minute and because I'm looking at the time, and I know that some people do have class starting at 1. It's now 10 of. If at any point you need to go because you have class, we totally get it. And then I'm going to turn it back to the panel to talk about what Dr. Johnson.
I have class, a number of units.
Part of the situation is social media companies have protection. You may have heard coverage of Section 230, the Communications Decency Act. And this was passed back in the mid-90s. And the idea there was basically that these platforms can't be or shouldn't be held liable for what is being posted on their platforms. So it provides kind of immunity for a lot of the material. So I mean, if there's something that's clearly illegal and they get a notification, they have to remove it. But as long as they don't go searching out, and as long as they don't go taking down things where there aren't those requests, then they don't have to police what's being said. And so that's part of the complication here. Free speech includes the right to say things that are demonstrably false, even when there are high consequences to that. And we can talk about whether that should be the case or shouldn't be the case. And especially right now, there's dire consequences for that being the case because people are hearing it. And it's not only there, though. It's also on broadcast TV, right? Turn on Fox News some nights and see what they're talking about. The coverage of the horse dewormer and, the vaccine conspiracies and things like that. And so, I mean, it's not just in social media. And what do we do about that? Well, there's talks of reforms of that law to, provide for basically the ability for more speech to be taken down, and maybe that'll include things like that. I don't know. There's arguments about, well, who gets to determine what's false and what isn't. Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms are labeling. And so that's at least a step, saying, if anything mentions vaccine or anything related to that, you see a little thing on there that says, go to the CDC's website, click this link. And so that was at least a step, but for a while we didn't even have that. And then that doesn't cover things like, well, what about claims of election fraud and things like that led to the January 6th insurrection? What happens there? There's no little thing that says, well, I guess they did eventually do that, but there's no little thing saying this is demonstrably false and, don't believe what you read on the internet. So.
And I mean, it really does highlight how much some of this free speech can really shape culture. Right? It can really shape the way we interact with what we see.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if I can, because it seems like, regulation is not, again, really possible, and even though we can make steps to kind of force these companies and platforms to take a higher ethical stance on what they're going to be regulating and maybe take some of the burden off user regulations, that's really what they're relying on is us to report on one another, which increases the distrust we have in one another in our country, not a great thing. But, I would love to hear your thoughts on other ways to combat this, trend to uncivil discourse online besides censorship, because that, isn't, in my opinion, getting to the root of the problem. Like, we need, would it be great if we all just didn't say these types of things and just understood, but, we have a large portion of our population who won't even accept that systemic racism is impacting us today, won't even accept that these systemic inequalities, are having a true impact on their fellow neighbors. And so what do you do then when censorship is really not going to get to that root?
I mean, I think that it goes back to what we all were saying earlier about values, right? So when we think about ourselves as an institution and as a community, what are our values? And how do we ensure that they're reflected in what happens on our campus? And we may even say, how do they get reflected in the classroom? You know, so it really requires all of us to come together to define what those values are and how do we operationalize the values day to day. It can be in a lot of different ways. Some of them are, you know, sphere of influence, maybe smaller. In the classroom, it becomes creating those courageous spaces where people are nurturing and supported. We might even infuse trauma-informed teaching practice, right? So how do we do that? So it really depends on where you are, but really I believe that it starts with really defining and really breaking down and operationalizing what our values look like behaviorally, right?
And education is the biggest thing here. So I mean, you know, we all teach critical thinking skills, right? That's the biggest thing that I think helps combat this. What is it I'm reading? Does this seem plausible? Where can I look up and see this is complete craziness? No, this isn't true. And so education, yes, college education would be great if everybody had to get a college education, but primary and secondary schooling and exposing people to those diverse communities, those diverse lives. You know, growing up, if you're growing up in a community, you're a white person, you're growing up in an all-white community, you have nobody who you're exposed to that has a different relationship with society because of their race, and you don't get any education in that either. How do you even know that this is a problem? And, you know, you look at the media and then you see it and you're like, oh, I don't believe that because, you know, that's not what my life is like. I don't see that anywhere here. So.
Leo had her hand up.
More into misinformation part, I think it's not really just the media. Because it reminded me of terrifying news pieces I just read yesterday from NPR about doctors going around giving public talks about misinformation about vaccine and prescribe that is not scientifically proved effective treatment to patients and kind of selling panic, like we're running out, you got to get on it immediately. Yeah. I mean, how about professionals? They're supposed to have code of ethics. They swore, the doctors swore to code of ethics, and it was supposed to be governed or regulated by professional boards. But what they found out about the boards was that they consist of lawyers and doctors who only have time to respond to complaints against specific physicians. You know, rather than these people kind of going around giving public talks about misinformation. And there seems to be no regulation or anything over them. They can do whatever they want to get to keep their license. And that's really terrifying at a time of life and death with the pandemic and doctors, professionals, giving misinformation, not on social media, in public talks, going around.
Yeah.
Now they're protected by freedom of speech, they should not. And just, you know, how do we regulate such situations?
And I think it goes back to what Ray was saying about critical consumption of, right, so looking at sources. And I think really learning how to take that information in. But what you wanted to say earlier, you were talking about legitimacy. That becomes even more crucial to look at who is the source and how are they back. And we know as educators, we look at what's your research on this, right? Is this trustworthy? Is that, so looking at all of that critical consumption, I think, that's a big factor.
And that goes back to what Ray said. We really have to teach critical consumption because those who don't believe may think they are practicing critical consumption, right? They may think, well, I don't agree with that, I don't believe that, so therefore it's critical.
Yeah, and when you look at what New York State schools are doing right now in general and kind of addressing media literacy or not addressing media literacy, we're not. I mean, we have now one-to-one tech infrastructure. We're putting students on computers in first grade, but we're not starting to teach them these types of critical thinking skills. And how can we, even as a higher education institution, put pressure, right, on our public lower education institutions to start integrating these things early on? Because, I mean, some schools have it in high school, which is great, but again, like, these kids are getting the influence from day one. By the time it's high school, it's too late. If they spent their whole childhood ingesting only Fox News, it is too late to change their perspective by the time they're 18, or it's hard to, right? When you can't get them outside of that social and personal sphere, which is what high school is like. You know, when they go to college, they get disconnected from their family and from that pressure to believe those values that were set up within your own unit. But that's not happening too, and more white males are turning away from college, right? The group that has the hardest rate to change this perspective is going to college less and less. So are we going to be seeing an even greater trend in this kind of extreme ideology being passed on because we're not getting this critical, education early on?
I have a question, I guess, about slightly a question about the classroom, I guess. So not about some of the more extreme forms of hate speech and things like that, and just kind of thinking about what we do here at the university. And I'm curious from your standpoint of being in the classroom with students or working with students, responding to their experiences in the classroom. It's hard to get students to disagree with each other sometimes. I mean, this is kind of ironic that it's a panel on free speech and none of you have really disagreed with each other about anything. And so I'm curious just especially given it's such a contentious topic in so many ways. Have you been noticing that? And, how have you been how has this made you think about this in part? Because in some ways there was a study that came out recently about university students that the number one thing university, and I forget who this is, so forgive me, the number one thing university students fear is actually not the professor, it's other students. And if they say something that is received in a way that it wasn't intended, right? This is where there are lots of microaggressions, obviously. They fear retribution outside of the classroom. And I'm just curious, from trying to cultivate, at the university, robust discussions about issues where people don't agree, and our values are things we will probably disagree about, right? In some instances. So I'm just curious the extent to which you see this in the classroom and how you thought about or interacting with students and how you thought about it.
So for me, I teach controversial topics. So I mean, civil rights and liberty, like they lend themselves to, there are two sides of each of these cases, right? And so one of the things I have noticed this, and it has become increasingly a problem, one of the things I do is I don't frame it as kind of when we're talking about the arguments in the case, like what is your take on this, or what do you think? But I'll say, okay, well, who can explain to us what the arguments were on this side? And who can explain to me what the arguments were on that side? It takes them out of it. So the student knows, like if I'm saying, what it was that was being argued against Dred Scott being a human being, they're not saying that I agree with this is my argument, but rather they're just, explaining this is what it was that individual was arguing. And so taking them out of it by kind of putting it hypothetical and saying, who can explain to us or who could make an argument in favor of that type of thing. I found some success with that.
Yeah, and to go off of that, it's like, what other perspective could you come up with? And trying to come up with as many different perspectives as possible and really even pushing on. So it's not, again, about you expressing your own perspective, but trying to think outside of your own perspective, really, and getting the students to do that. To me, is almost more powerful than getting them to express their own opinion. Because we know our opinion, we can be great at expressing it when we're in the right circumstances and scenarios. But getting, to me, critical thinking is taking yourself outside of that. It means being able, once you do that, then you can examine your own perspective a little bit better as well.
I would add also that maybe creating or providing a framework for how to have these difficult discussions, right? So maybe, and for me, my courses are in clinical mental health, so they're a little bit different, but we still have to look at how all of these intersect, right? So we take a position of what we call cultural humility, that idea that perhaps your point of view is correct for you and mine is for me. So where is the middle ground in that? Right? How do I do that non-judgmentally without putting you down? So I'm coming at it from trying to understand how come it makes sense for you to think that way in you, with your history, with what you've been through, and how do we now make this work? And I think that position can also help in the classroom, right? So, and this becomes tough because I'll say that as a minoritized person, I have to also understand how come the dominant position would hold on or want to hold on to power that way. So when I take a cultural humility stance, it makes sense why you would want to fight me on this. It makes sense, right? So if I was in a position of power, I wouldn't want to give it up too. Right? So it makes sense. So that allows me to not have that resistance, right? So if I can understand you and your position and you understand mine, what do we do next? Right? So I think that's been really helpful for me.
Yeah. Just one really brief comment. I'm not intentionally using this word, triggered something in my brain. One of the enormous controversies in the library world at the moment, which is not really a hotbed of controversy normally, but in this case, trigger warnings. Because as a librarian, I find any attempt to dissuade a user from free access to information absolutely anathema to me personally and professionally. I come from a family of librarians. But my other master's degrees in mental health counseling, in fact, Portia was my professor. And so I do, empathize with students who could potentially be triggered by reading a book that had themes that would be potentially triggering to them based on their trauma history. So I think that there are many different fields of sort of grappling between those two issues that you mentioned before, Portia.
Yeah. And I think that we have to be clear that allowing people who are traumatized to have a little bit of information before we expose them is not necessarily coddling them, right? So the debate sometimes is, I'm going to coddle you and not let you really deal with difficult topics if I do this. But that's not the case. So trauma-informed doesn't mean you have to protect people from difficult things. It means if I'm traumatized, my front of my brain doesn't work. That's what I need to process, to learn, to remember things, to file them away. But if you tell me with a background in trauma that I'm going to be looking at traumatic material, I allow this brain to stay alert so that I can integrate and learn rather than be flooded by all of these memories that are in the back of the brain that have nothing to do with logic, right? So I think we have to also look at what does it mean to offer treatment. It's not just to coddle, it's to prepare the brain to be able to do this difficult work. It's like a scaffolding, right? You're scaffolding the brain to be able to be ready to deal with all of that. So that's a great point too.
I think Liz had something.
I was going to say, so I teach primarily, I'm in sociology, and I teach primarily on race and immigration. And so I have had to think a lot about how to have conversations in the classroom and kind of to balance both students being able, participate and feeling like they can be open, but also not, having a barrage of microaggressions for students of color in the classroom. In case, when I first, it's different with every student population, but, first teaching here, I was kind of alarmed at some of the things students would say in the classroom. I didn't know that they would articulate that, right? And so it became a process of, I looked online for some guidelines on how to have these discussions. So the Southern Poverty Law Center has a great set of guidelines for kind of pointers to keep in mind when you're having discussions, describing the difference between intent and impact and how everybody can kind of keep that in mind as they're having these discussions. I've also learned to kind of foreclose certain comments, right? Like I can, explain that there is a stereotype that's based on all of these things and where that stereotype comes from, what purposes it serves in reproducing inequalities, and that will foreclose a student from articulating that stereotype. And then also, trying to within my discipline, encourage students to take a sociological perspective, right? So to think about, where does my idea come from? Like, how is that informed by my social position? And also, if someone said something, why would they think that? Like, from their social position, kind of like you were saying, what has informed their ideas about this particular topic. So it's hard, but it's also important to have students feel like they can participate and kind of balance those things in the classroom.
Yeah. And I think that social position is important because it's also representation. So it may seem like a really simple act as an instructor, but just to also make sure that our content represents like diverse views, right? So if we select content that will represent and help all of our students feel like their voice is really not minimized, I find that helps with those discussions.
Yeah, I should say, too, my question comes from, I teach American literature, so we do a lot of the literature of slavery. I'm actually doing a class right now on social unrest, because in response essentially to January 6th, the historical depictions of events like that. So it's kind of inherent to the subject matter, but that's where the
Absolutely.
I teach two classes that are riddled with landmines for the communication project. Political communication and propaganda. And in both courses, I learned early on that I defined hate speech on the first night. It's in the syllabus. I assume nobody's going to read it there, so we go over it. And then I remind them of it throughout the semester. And I also, make a point of saying that personal anecdotes are important, but at the same time, getting personal with someone else is not always appropriate in our class. And if we could keep it at an academic level, hopefully that will help. But yeah, like I say, and it comes from strange places. I had an African American student. We were in political communication class. I asked him to bring in a protest song, and he brought in some country song by some white guy who was known as an incredible racist country singer. And the song was about sending them all back to Africa. And this was a black student who had brought this in. And I knew ahead of time he was going to do it. And I said, if this is offensive, and I'm telling you right now, I find it offensive, but I don't want to not allow the student to share what he's found. So if you think it'll be offended, please leave the classroom. It wasn't enough. I had students who stayed because they felt embarrassed that they might leave. And I realized at that point, no, the onus is on me, not the student. So at that point, I think I actually talked with Butterfly about it, and she suggested, really define hate speech and tell people there's no place for it in the class. And that's helped a lot. But, we just got done talking about World War II, and you can't do that without covering Nazi propaganda, So, like I say, landmines everywhere.
I wonder if that also talks about how to maybe cultivate that, like what is needed in that community space to cultivate the space where people feel like this is a place where they can be comfortable and be themselves and be represented.
Real quick, in the classroom of teacher education, what happened is almost the opposite. Everyone is so careful not to show anything for the concern of offending others. So a lot of times what you hear from teacher candidates is, I'm not doing that because it may affect someone. And then they will go to the other extreme. They show up as a colorblind, right? I treat everyone the same. I don't see race. I don't see anything that is different from me. We're all the same. And that is not good. It's not productive. You're not going anywhere. When you're trying to carry on this difficult conversation, a lot of times what you feel is this implicit resistance because of the fear. Because, most of them coming from middle class white, and most of my teacher candidates are actually female, so they are afraid of offending others. We want to be nice. If you're nice to me, I'm nice to you, we're all nice to each other, and then nothing unpleasant will exist. So let's just pretend that. Of course, it's going to perpetuate the status quo and just keep the system system going and kind of like duplicate whatever is existing. It's not working. So I constantly fight this resistance, and I like to have learn more about Portia, what you mentioned, to create a framework so we can have this, make a difficult conversation productive. I do not want to just say, oh, you just said something that is very racist. Did you notice that? Because that's going to be, you put a period to everything, and they're going to check themselves out. So no, they're not going to engage in the conversation at all. Yeah. And this is extremely important because every time I think about these are the human beings who will go out and teach K-12, quick K-12 children, and that will be in the next 20 years. These are the people who's going to educate our younger generation. It's scary to think about that they have this idea. Over the past 10 years, I think I had one student, just one, say really very clearly out loud in class discussion saying, I'm a racist, I know that, but I don't care. One. Now, of course, I have to say, okay, well, let's pause and talk about this, unpack that. And she said, I don't even want to talk about this. So I would say, okay, now we need to talk. If you don't talk in class, we need to talk after class. I don't want to share what happened later, but it's a very common occurrence in the classroom. So I'm actually curious. I'm learning all the time. What I can do, particularly when I look different from students, when I share Beverly Caton's concept of a systematic racism, I got students in the classroom, arm closed and leg crossed, and then said so. And then there's one time a student was looking at me and said, well, do Chinese have racism? Is this an issue? So I had to laugh and said, well, I don't think that's relevant, right? We're not talking about anything happened there. Distracting from the conversation all the time. Yeah. Sometimes the direct attacking to the instructor. Yeah. Even my first few years, I was teaching using the same syllabus as my colleagues who are teaching parallel sections of the same course. We got 3 or 4 cohorts every year. And when we shared co-planning, co-reflecting, my colleagues were shocked at what I heard from my students. They feel okay saying that in my class, but they wouldn't say that in other instruction classes. They may not know it. That's what we call it implicit biases. Right. So what can we do so that we can have, again, I'm going to repeat this. I would like to say productive conversation, right, about difficult topics so we're going somewhere. I'm exhausted trying to fight this resistance and fighting for, what can we do to try all kinds of things. I'm not feeling that I'm coddling them. I would like to think that I'm challenging them, but I don't think I learned enough. I'm forever in the learning mode.
So I think that we have so many layers here that we could probably talk for another few hours, if not all semester long. Next week on Wednesday, we're actually gathering with anyone who would like to have a part in helping with some of these small group discussions. And exactly what you're talking about is going to be one of the things we talk about. How do we frame things in a way that helps support people with divergent viewpoints and not re-traumatize people who have been traumatized? It's very difficult. And I think that this is something that we're all going to always be learning, right? Because we can't see what we're missing. We can't see through other people's eyes. So that's going to be next week. I've actually booked this room. So if you're interested, whether or not if you're just going to attend some small group discussions or you're helping to facilitate, I welcome you. And then starting that Friday, we have a whole series for a week of different sorts of topics. So we have your say, it matters, a free speech discussion on that Friday. Then over the next week, we have a lot of self-care because we have to, as we unpack all of this, self-care becomes very, very important. If we are not feeling well, if we have been triggered, if we are having a bad day, we're not capable of looking fully at what other people might be seeing and responding in a way that is very nurturing or helpful. So we have self-care, we have a nature walk, we have art as self-care, music as self-care, writing as self-care. We also have free speech and trauma. We have how to stay in dialogue when opinions vary. So I really encourage people to take a look at that. I will be sending those out, again, all through the digest, and on Facebook and Instagram. And, I want to thank everyone for coming today. Hopefully we can keep unpacking these layers. After we finish talking about trauma and free speech and self-care, we're going to go into a round of what does it mean to deal with or not deal with trauma in the classroom or workspace. So again, all relates, and many layers of this onion to peel. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.